welcome everybody to our session. Thank you for coming. We're glad to all be here. We're especially glad to have Miles with us. So thanks for rescheduling. This session is all about taking a look at our process for how we're starting to develop professional competencies to build within the ARIS community and build the capacity of our ARIS membership. You can see there's quite a few of us involved in this initiative that has largely been led by Miles, which you're going to hear from in a minute. But before we jump into that, I think the first slide, Megan, if you want to jump in, I think Miles actually, who's running the slides. We can talk a little bit about what we mean by broader impacts and engaged scholarship. I think most of us in this community are all too familiar with the two criteria built around intellectual merit and broader impacts. And the focus, of course, on looking at the societal impacts of projects. And so we just heard, if you were all in the session previous to this with our speaker from TIPS, I mean, this is an exciting development to start to think about the societal impacts of our work and how the myriad of ways that we can accomplish that directly and indirectly related to the research of the PIs that we work with. And of course, looking at community engagement and how we share some, but not all of these areas of emphasis that are promoted within the broader impacts community. So that's just to kind of get our mindset going. There are many different areas of emphasis in the broader impact world. And I think many of you, hopefully all of you are familiar with the 10 different investment areas, as NSF likes to call them. And all of them having, different outlets, again, and varieties of ways in which we can achieve broader impacts. Go ahead, Miles, to the next one. So for those of us that support this type of work, it's been interesting over the last few years trying to, as ARIS has developed, trying to kind of define what these professional communities are. And it's actually been really difficult because we all come at this community of practice from very different points of view. This is a definition that I think I got from one of the NABI documents early on, and it's a nice definition and inclusive, thinking about us as knowledge brokers, partnership coordinators, capacity builders, variety of people approaching it from different angles who all support and participate in research, education, communication, and of course, community engagement. Between the academics and diverse stakeholders, such as K-12, informal education, industry, and society at large. That's a very broad, all-encompassing definition, but also quite inclusive in terms of, how we view ourselves as professionals. But in reality, I think you'll see on the next slide that if we're going to build capacity in a very broad community of folks, we all come at it with very different titles within different university structures. We have very overlapping skills. Many of us are generalists, or what I like to say I am as a jack of all trades, really focused on a variety of different skills, as you can see here in all of these bubbles. But the main one being that we all, I think, universally act as connectors, trying to connect partnerships in productive ways to achieve those different investment areas that you saw in the previous slide. So the profile of how you develop competencies can be very broad and very difficult to nail down, because you can see just this broad range of skills that and job titles that fall within our discipline. So with that, I think what we're going to do now is, think about a little bit about how you frame yourself. We've had trouble in the past with people trying to fit themselves in a bin, but again, as a researcher, administrator, or research impacts professional, no matter what angle you come at, we're going to talk a little bit about the process that we have for the competency project that we've worked on. Anything, Megan, you want to add to that? I know you've talked a lot about this as well. I'll let you chime in if you have any other comments that I missed.
No, I don't think so. I think you've hit our frustration.
Yeah, trying not to say it's frustrating, but actually, it's been difficult to define. So, and then of course, getting the competencies to align to this kind of nebulously defined field that has a lot of different facets to it.
Yeah, so thank you, Janice. I'll take it over here, and apologies for my raspy voice. COVID last week did a real number on my voice, and it hasn't fully recovered yet. My portion of the discussion today is really to talk about our process for developing a set of competencies for broader impact professionals. And Janice just spent some time talking about the diversity of backgrounds of broader impacts professionals and various kinds of training that they have received. And in recognition of that, one of our dear colleagues, Diane Doberneck, did a huge literature review of relevant competency frameworks. So that's where we started, was with her literature review. And she identified 426 competencies across these different, essentially cognate disciplines: service learning, community-engaged research, the competencies of extension professionals and community engagement professionals. That's based on Lena Distilio's work, knowledge mobilization, broader impact, science outreach and engagement, and also a start list of competencies that members of the ARIS leadership and training team had developed. And as a result of that extensive literature review, as I said, we ended up with this gigantic spreadsheet with 426 competencies, many of which were duplicative. And so the next task was really to collapse those into a more manageable set. And we tried to aim for something sort of in the middle. So things that were not so general that they would be competencies that any professional should possess, like the ability to conduct meetings effectively. So we got rid of those. And then we also eliminated competencies that were really specific to a particular kind of BI work. So for example, K-12 STEM education. So we wanted to get something in the middle that was really reflective of competencies across different kinds of or different flavors of BI professionals. And we went through as a group 3 rounds of reviewing competencies, reducing, collapsing competencies that were similar. And the end result there was, in that stage, 83 non-duplicative competencies that were organized in 11 domains. And those 11 competency areas were institutional leadership for broader impacts, understanding the history and context of broader impacts, being familiar with the foundational scholarship that informs broader impact work, having the ability to network and engage others in broader impacts work, facilitating and negotiating community collaborations, the ability to cultivate high quality partnerships, the ability to engage in capacity building with stakeholders and community partners, understanding DEI and cross-cultural understanding as it relates to broader impact work, being able to perform faculty and staff development activities for broader impacts, broader impact program administration and project development, and then also finally resource development and management to sustain a broader impacts operation in an institution of higher education. I'll go ahead and move on and talk to you about the Delphi study that we performed with those 83 competencies. So the Delphi method, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. It's a commonly used technique to achieve consensus on a topic among a sample of experts. Its key features are anonymity of responses among participants. So participants don't know who is responding how. And really that's useful because it counteracts the effect of group pressure to conform around a particular idea. It also counteracts the effects of strong personalities Not that the broader impact community has highly opinionated people with strong communities. Fortunately, we don't have that problem. It also involves multiple rounds of questionnaires, so it's an iterative process with ongoing feedback to participants as the process unfolds. So really our first step in the Delphi study was to identify our BI experts. So the four of us, Diane, Janice, Megan, and I put our heads together and co-generated a list of 36 recognized BI experts. And our goal was to recruit between 10 and 15 of them into our study. We also engaged in some purposive sampling to try to get representation across the different institutional types you see here on the screen. Unfortunately, that did not work because nearly everyone who ended up responding was from a public land grant four-year institution. So that goal was not achieved. And we haven't really thought about how that might have influenced the results. So the Delphi study consisted in our case of 2 rounds of surveys. So in the first round, we emailed an invitation to complete the survey to 22 BI experts, and 11 responded yes, they'd be happy to do it. So they received a questionnaire with the 83 competencies organized into the 11 areas of competence. And they're asked to rate each competency's importance on a scale from not at all important to extremely important. They were also asked to comment on the clarity, wording, or any other aspect of the competency they cared to comment on, and also to suggest any competencies they thought were perhaps missing from any of the 11 areas. So after we had gathered the data from the round 1 survey, we calculated our descriptive statistics, and the most important step here was to define what we meant by consensus. What's an acceptable level of consensus at which we will adopt a competency as a permanent competency. So what we used was a threshold of greater than or equal to 75% of our 11 experts rating the competency either very or extremely important, with a low interquartile range of below 2.5. So IQRs are a measure of variability. So we wanted low variability and high agreement that the competency was very important. And we also defined a negative consensus sort of as the other end of the spectrum, where less than 51% of experts thought that the competency was very or extremely important, and also a very low variability. So 83 competencies go into that round 1 survey, and 3 are dropped out either because, well, mostly because the comments in the round 1 survey suggested that they were either redundant or unnecessary, or there was one that met the threshold for negative consensus. And then of the 83 competencies that went into the round 1 survey, 35 went to the final group of final competencies. So 29 of those were not revised in any way. So they met that above 75% threshold. And another 6 underwent very minor revisions, but not significant enough to actually change the meaning of the competency. And then from that round 1 survey, 22 competencies went into the round 2 survey, not revised. We still had not achieved consensus on those. 23 were revised based on comments in the round 1 survey. And then there were 3 new that were suggested. So in the round 2 questionnaire, We sent surveys to our 11 round one respondents. Unfortunately, only 9 completed after 3 reminders. We missed 2. So if a competency in the round 2 questionnaire was new or substantially revised, we asked respondents to rate the importance from not at all to extremely important. And also, as they had in round 1, comment on the clarity, the wording, or any other aspect of the competency. And then for competencies that were not revised, respondents received all of the qualitative comments about that competency from round 1. So they got to see how everyone else reacted to it, what they said about it. They also received the group median rating for a competency, as well as their own rating, so they could judge how far from the group consensus they were. And then they were invited to, once again, rate the importance of the competency from not at all to extremely important. And as a result of the round 2 survey, 18 were dropped because they did not meet the threshold for consensus, and 30 went into the final set for a total of 65 competencies, still organized according to those 11 areas. Now, I could go through this list of 11 areas and give you an example of each, but I think that's boring. And so what I suggest you do is go to the conference platform and download the set of draft competencies, which are just below where you see our names and the session description. You can go ahead and download the draft set of competencies, which will give you all 65 organized by these 11 areas. And then we're going to have a discussion later on in this session about them. So go ahead and go grab that. Make sure you have it handy for yourself, and then we'll come back and talk about that more. But the process of arriving at a final empirically derived set of competencies is not done yet. So 65 is an awful lot, and it's in some ways not practical for assessment or training purposes. And so Ellen Iverson and Kerry Vachta from Carleton College are engaged in a second round of surveying with a much larger group of people, and are using factor analytic techniques to come up with a more parsimonious set of competencies. And so I'm going to hand it off to Kerry now to talk about that process.
So actually, before I joined SERC, the team here undertook a community survey, and that had 2 purposes. One was to empirically test the proposed 11 domain structure, and also to examine the potential for dimension and item reduction. As Miles said, there were a large number of items to include in the survey for it to be useful. So their goal was to help explore the extent to which we could reduce the number of items and the number of domains and still have a meaningful assessment. They surveyed the broadest set of known individuals who've been engaged in the ARIS community. That included those with high engagement who were participating in summits or a webinar and served on a leadership team, people at the middle level who had participated in either a summit or a webinar, and then low engagement were those who had been on an interest list but may not have participated in other activities. We had a goal of getting 200 responses, and that number was chosen because at that level we would be able to move on to our next analysis. I'm sorry, I'm on the next slide. So at the 200 responses, we would be able to move on to the statistical analyses that would allow us to explore the domain reduction. And you can move on to the next one. So we did reach our 200 respondents, and from there we were able to move into a factor analysis process. There are actually 4 steps or 4 analyses we used in that process. And I wanted to get a sense of what kind of experience anybody in the audience has had with factor analysis. sorry. So if you've used factor analysis before or at all familiar with it, can you enter yes in the chat? Just so I get a sense. I don't want to put a lot of time into describing it if most people are familiar or if. Okay, so it looks like the folks who've responded have some familiarity at least. So I'll give a pretty brief, if we can go to the next slide. Briefly, a lot of times we'll talk about scales, scores, and means. Oftentimes we'll talk about means, and folks are familiar that a mean will look at the average between two items, but the distribution can be very, very different. So in the diagram on the left, we might have, say, on a scale of 1 to 5, we have a 1 and a 5, and the one on the right, we might have a 2 and a 4, but they both have the same mean. So the mean doesn't really tell us what the distribution looks like. But if we go to factor analysis, the next slide, what factor analysis does is really looks for linear relationships that account for sort of the white space between the dots. So each dot is a survey response. So it will identify the number of linear relationships that best account for the variance in the responses. That's our really brief overview, and I can get more into it if anybody's interested in a different form. So what our analysis did was we applied what's called principal components analysis. This is the next slide. Thank you. Which is the most commonly used. It's actually not a true factor analysis, but it's very effective for data reduction. So we ran PCA and we identified 9 factors initially, but 2 of them had no items that were more strongly related to that domain than to any others. So we dropped that and we're left with 7 factors, which in this context is roughly equivalent to what Miles is talking about when he uses the term domains. So we ended up identifying 7 factors that were pretty effective, but the PCA approach assumes that there is no correlation between those factors and that the data fall on a normal curve. And that's actually not true of our data. So from there, we went on just to validate what we'd found by using principal access factoring, which actually is a true factor analysis. And principal access factoring doesn't require those 2 assumptions. The data can be correlated, and they aren't necessarily on a normal curve. So we reran the factor analysis using principal access, and we actually got validated our 7 factor solution. There were a handful, 3 or 4 items that landed on different factors, but we still got 7 factors, and almost all of the items landed on the same factors that they had in the previous analysis. So from that point, we went back to sort of roughly replicated the Delphi approach, but using a different team. In fact, most of the team are the folks you're seeing on screen, and asked them to review the results we got and to help us identify conceptually what the factors seem to be measuring. So we gave them each set of items that fell on each factor, and they were able to look through those conceptually and get a sense of this seems to be measuring, building capacity among faculty, for example, was one of them. So we've gone through that process. We identified what the items seem to be conceptually mapping. And then if you go to, I think, the next one. And then we went through and had folks rate each item as they were organized in those factors to identify which ones seemed to be really essential, which ones seemed unnecessary, where there were redundancies. And then on the left, that sort of shows how I color coded for our analyses. So anything with that dark green in the upper left next to item 58 shows everybody responded that that was an essential item. Where you see gray, somebody marked it as unnecessary, but you can see like 59 also has some people marked it as essential. So there's a mix and match. Some items, everybody said the same thing. There was a lot of diversity in how folks felt about it. Others, item 57, you see several people identified that as essential, but somebody identified that as redundant. And they had suggested choosing the other one that they felt it was redundant with. Because 3 people thought that was essential, we'll probably drop the second item that they felt was redundant and keep this one that everybody else felt was essential. So that sort of shows how we're moving through this process of gaining the expert panel's insights and then using that to help reduce so that we can still be looking at those key factors with the fewest number of items that will still hopefully generate meaningful assessments along those domains. So that's our next step. We'll actually be reducing the items and rerunning our factor analysis using the items that were identified as essential or near essential and dropping the redundancies and the unnecessary, and see if that our 7-factor solution is again validated once we've stripped out the items that at this point seem like they might be. We might not necessarily need them to still be able to effectively measure our 7 factors.
So we're going to hand it over to Megan now to talk about what we intend to do with these lovely competencies that we've worked so hard to identify.
Yeah, Miles, that's usually my assumption too, when there aren't any questions, is that we were just perfect. So it's good that we're all assuming that. As one in the group who I appreciate all the evaluation, don't necessarily 100% understand it all. I found it fascinating how we went from 426 down to 65, and probably down even further till then to get something that's really an evidence-based list of those in the community. Because when we really started thinking about certification with the advent of the ARIS grant, Janice and I think another couple people were seeing their writing and, okay, who are we to decide what people need to learn, right? And what is going to be available on a certification. So going through this process with Miles and Diane and the people from SERC has been really great to, in my mind, validate things that we were thinking along the lines were important anyway. We did have our original ARIS list of what we thought competencies would be, and a lot of those have seemed to hold up in the long run. So what do we plan on doing with this? It's all well and good. It's neat. What do we plan on doing with it? Or are we just going to put it out into the ether? If you were at our session, Janice and my session last week on certification and micro-credentialing, then you got a little bit of taste of what we plan on doing with these competencies. But we want to map these competencies to some of the modules that we are developing for training and for certification, so that we can really do a kind of skills assessment of, once you go through these modules, you should be able to have the qualities of these competencies, and therefore the certification is really substantial and accurate to skills needed for the field, right? The other thing that we're really kind of hoping for is, get some sort of self-assessment based on these competencies, provide professionals with that self-assessment so that they can take that, see where they have skills, and then maybe only take the modules of certification on areas that they're lacking, but are still important to their position. So that's a little bit of thought. It's also going to, codify the skills that we've already acquired, right? There's a lot of us who I think have been working in this field for a while, and is everybody going to have to do certification? Probably not. We'll work on some sort of mechanism to use the competencies as a way of, doing a self-assessment or creating a portfolio based on what these competencies are that can prove that you already have this knowledge and skill set. So you don't have to take the time to go through all the certification, but maybe provide a portfolio or some sort of test that really says that everybody in this field, whether you are advanced or beginning, whether you have gone through a certification program or not, you have the skills that you need to continue to advance in the broader impact or research impact realm. And this is, I think, the biggest thing throughout this process and going into a certification program is that we're really not providing a standard, right? Much like there's a lot of other various job areas, such as program management, where there are professional standards in place that you can get certified in, that you can put on a resume and say, I have this credential. And so that legitimizes this particular area. That's what we're hoping to build through the certification, and have, for the list of competencies. And that's really just it just further, I think, solidifies that we do have a community of practice, right? It's not just those in ARIS who have gone through this process to say these are the ones that are important. It's those who've been in the leadership of ARIS or friends of ARIS, like Miles and Diane, who have done the work and narrowed it down so that we can have something that seems doable to send out to our community, right? And make sure that we have the community's backing with the competencies and the skill sets that we are looking at, that we deem as important, and that no matter what area you are in, as Janice mentioned earlier, whether you are administration, whether you are a researcher, whether you're K-12, whether you sit in a research development office, these are still a basic set of skills and set of knowledge that everyone who is working in this space will have. So it has been a challenge to try and get all of those areas figured out, but I think we are coming to a place where it's going to work out. Our next step, when we get the final set of competencies from the factor analysis, is to really map that across to modules. And, much in the same way that, teachers in the K-12 curriculum development have to map their curriculum to national standards, right? We'll go through a process similar to that, where, we might not have a task directly related to every competency, but everything that you are doing will relate to something that could be farther down the road, as far as getting to that skill, getting to that competency, right? I think we are on to, is that all we had for?
Yep, that was our last slide, and I think we can open it up for discussion now. And
Yeah,
perhaps folks have had an opportunity to download the list of competencies, and they have some comments or questions about them or the process.
so yeah, are there any questions out there for our group on the work that's been done so far? We can talk more about plans moving ahead. Sorry, I had to download the
Bipolar depression. It made me feel trapped in the sand. This is art inspired by real.
Sorry, that something opened. Gabriel, why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
Thank you. That was great. It was both really fascinating to read the list of competencies and to hear the process and how you sorted through things. And as I was looking over things, I found myself both anchoring on the verbs and also the sort of I don't know, topic areas or activities or artifacts, as the case may be, in the different descriptions. And so it just brought up a few different sort of maybe both comments and clarifications that I had in mind. And maybe the one thing that stood out most immediately was I saw that most of them seem to sort of fall into the sort of socio-cognitive realm. And that might be like in contrast to like physical or sensory types of skills. And so I find myself wondering about things like presentation or presenting and performing and demonstrating and building and things like that, sort of in contrast. And then I was also sort of looking and I was imagining for some in particular, the word assist in contrast, say, to lead. And as you were describing, I was sort of realizing that because these are competencies, you perhaps were trying to sort of normalize for like the most common or the most common set that would be applicable or sort of basic level. And so, but it just made me wonder about sort of levels of competence and sort of how you had maybe been thinking about that as well. So just some general comments.
I don't know if Janice heard all of that, but yes, we've had many conversations about various levels and what is getting too niche into a specific area, such as like science communication is a big one. I think there's a lot in here about partnering in networking, which is big for some, not necessarily for others, and cultivating that partnership. It was, I think, really fortuitous that Janice and I are both on this group working on competencies, because on the spectrum of those who really are what I would call like a practitioner who manages programs that actually go out and do education or outreach and those things, and researchers are partnering with them. Janice is on that side of the spectrum, and I'm on the opposite side of the spectrum, where it's really in a like a pre-award capacity, where we're very much in the proposal development process, and I match make them with other program partners like Janice, and then kind of send them on their way, right? And how do we get a list that really applies to both sides? Because we are in our individual tasks, I think, working one-on-one with researchers, there's a lot of things that we do that are in common. But how do you represent that? And then there's other things that Janice does that I don't, and things I do that Janice doesn't. So we have had many conversations on, are we assisting or are we doing? And are we, are you actually doing, for example, training? Are you actually delivering those types of things, or are you just sitting and consulting using some of these resources? And that's all been considered, which I think is, and Janice can agree, is one reason that we sent it out to, experts in the field through the Delphi study, and then literally anybody who wanted to answer the second round survey, just to get some more input and consensus, because we had struggled with that so much. Janice, is there anything you had to add?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And that's why we started this presentation with that jack of all trades comment, because, we got a lot of pushback early on the, as Megan referred to it, as a spectrum. Many people don't see this field as a spectrum at all, going from someone like me to someone like Megan. They see it as multidimensional, where you have sort of, very different facets. So that's kind of why we switched gears on that. Our original presentation of this was more of a continuum, if you will, on an axis, on a time series of, me to Megan across the screen. But it's really not like that from what we hear. So, choosing a set of competencies that fits that range has been extremely challenging. And we're actually grateful for the work that Miles and Kerry have done to try to help us, kind of quantitatively or systematically try to sort through all of this range of potential skills with some sort of objective lens. But it's very challenging. Jeff.
Thanks. So
there you are. Okay.
You're back up. My question is, NABI transitioned to ARIS to be sort of broader than the focus on broader impacts. And that's not, I'm not trying to critique this, because I think this is an awesome body of work. And obviously you have to start somewhere, and broader impacts is the frame that you're using. But I can see this work being applied much more broadly, especially these competencies being applied much more broadly to those of us who are in this space, but aren't considered or have nothing to do with broader impacts, have nothing to do necessarily with university structures. So I'm just wondering if that has entered your thinking in any way, and if there's any thought about adapting or allowing these set of competencies to be adapted beyond sort of the world of broader impacts.
I mean, I can start by saying, I think if you look at not necessarily the list that Miles, so the list that Miles has with the 11 buckets is the 11 buckets that we originally put them in as a group and sent out to the Delphi study, right? And the 7 factors that Kerry came up with we mapped which competencies were in Miles's 11 buckets and Kerry's 7, and they mapped really well. And ended up, we cut out some of our buckets where you can see like capacity building with stakeholders only had 2 competencies under it, right? So that was probably one that got avoided, and those 2 competencies moved very well into a different group. That made a lot of sense. In that group of 7, I think there's a section, a factor that is very what I would call NSFE, where it's like the history of what broader impacts is, the broader impacts areas, how do you write a good plan, very proposal oriented. I think a lot of the other factors, potentially all 6 of the other factors, are not an SFE at all and could be easily generalized to other areas and other, whether it's other agencies or working outside of academic institutions, those types of things. At least that's my take on how all of them are shaking out.
I agree with that, Jeff. I think that there's as Megan said, there's sort of a core of them that are very specific to the BI world, but because many of these came from cognate disciplines, very closely related disciplines, they sort of lend themselves to broader applicability. So I definitely think there's room for doing exactly what you suggest.
Megan, there's a question in the chat. What is the best way to keep up with the future development of this work? And Caitlin, I'm glad you asked. There's plenty of room for additional insights from the community. This process is not going to work, and it's going to be iterative unless more of us engage in the process. Megan and I have been joking since our meeting in Durham just a bit ago. We're going to start recruiting you all to help us out to help do this match game scenario where we have all of these modules for micro-credentialing and professional development that we really want to match to this, wonderful list of competencies that Miles and Diane and Kerry and Ellen have been helping us with. So there's a lot more work to be done. So if you are at all interested, please do reach out to us and we will certainly give you a job and a role in helping to sort this out. There's no shortage of work to be done. So I'm going to put my email in the chat. So feel free to reach out to me.
That's one of the things I like about this community is these sort of standing invitations to get involved and help do the work. You don't always encounter that.
No, I have no problem putting people to work. So if you want to help out, you're more than welcome.
And I would say that one step where we could involve more in the community, like Caitlin, would be have multiple people doing that mapping and then seeing where there is consensus, right, between module, curriculum, and the competencies. Because I know Janice and I have attempted and tried to start, I don't think with the 65, but when there were 83, start that mapping process. And we both, after a few attempts or stops and starts, kind of decided, like, who am I to decide whether this competency actually addresses that necessarily, or if it's important, and we knew we were going to narrow it down more. But there was less agreement, I think, even between the two of us trying to start and stop, that I think we have a better idea of the process we want to go through now. And if we could get multiple people to kind of work on the process of mapping these two things together and see if we can come to consensus and then have discussion on the ones that we don't agree on, I think would be kind of a fantastic next step. So Caitlin, you're on the hook for that now. Are there other questions, comments? I can throw a question out to the group here of, after looking at the competencies in the document, or even just the different areas that we have listed, does it seem on par with maybe what you all do, or with what you would consider a broader impact professional to have? What those competencies are? Are we entirely off? Because that's also needed. We would also like to know that. What are some thoughts or general feelings on what we have listed? Repeat the question. Based on the competencies you see in the document, either the competencies, the individual competencies themselves, or the larger buckets that we have put them in, do we seem like it's on track with what you would expect skills of either your position or skills of what you would consider a BI professional to have? That was the question. Kyle.
My screen's so small because you're on the TV here. It's hard to see my cursor. So just looking, this was my first time seeing them. And so we just looked through, and I was just like, yes, 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 all of these are great. I remember taking the second survey and thinking the same thing. I'll need the time to process those. But one of my main questions is, it seems like a big chunk of the work is still to come, right? Like, who's going to create the module that trains someone in a particular competency? That seems like that is, well, yeah, the trickiest part. And I'm wondering what all plans are for that.
Oh, you're not kidding, Kyle. Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done, as you just noted. In our other session, we sort of touched on that a bit, and I'm happy to share that information with you from the hub. But we have been working on kind of a set of modules. I believe there's 9 of them. And if I can find the diagram quickly, I'll flash it up on the screen for you. But basically, yeah, trying to cover, map the 9 modules that we've been working on to these competencies is really the next task. Fortunately, Megan and Jory, and to some extent myself, have been providing professional development through ARIS over the last couple of years. And so we have stuff to work from that's been sort of an intuitive sense, right, of the things that we think the community needs, the community has asked for. So we do have that. And now it's this matching game of taking the practical kind of intuitive sense of what we've been doing and mapping it to this more systematic, objective set of competencies that Miles and Kerry just explained to you from the literature. So I think it's that has to happen next. And then I see my colleague is online here, Saj Lichtenwellner, myself and Saj and Megan and Jory will all be starting that process of developing them. And then what form will they take? Well, we're working on that as well, but there'll be this balance between online asynchronous modules that you sort of work through independently at your own pace, and the ability to bring what you've learned to the community in a reflective way in either face-to-face or online coaching kinds of situations, where you might submit, a product of some sort to complete your micro-credentialing. So that's the general gist, Kyle, of how we're thinking it's going to work. The particulars of that will happen. Our goal from our fearless leader, Susan Reno, is to have all of that up and running by the next summit, to the best of our ability, at least the lion's share of what we've been working on module-wise. Now, will that be comprehensive for those of you that are, let's say, more advanced, that have been doing this for a long time? Megan addressed this earlier. Probably not, but the basics, for new people entering the field and whatnot, will certainly be our first priority, is to get some of that basic information codified in this asynchronous, synchronous sort of back and forth, if you will. So I hope that helps, but I'm happy to share that network diagram with you of all the modules we're planning.
Yeah, no, that's great. That answers my question. It's good to know there's just some materials to build on. It's already out
Definitely,
there.
yeah.
Thank you.
That's the good news.
Yeah.
We have a lot of content. Let's see. Ryan commented in the chat that they do think that we are on track, and it's helping them think about who might be other collaborators and allies in the competencies where he might be lacking or practicing as part of his role. And I think that is a great point. Is also, and when we end up with this giant list with these buckets, hopefully it could be one person, but that could be a full-time job. And I think we know that a lot of us do BI support work as in addition to other jobs. So maybe you can have a full-time BI person with all of these competencies spread through a couple different people, right? And if it helps you realize, you know, I might not have the capacity or the bandwidth to, you know, do more credentialing in this particular area I'm in deficient, or I might be a little more deficient in. I know so-and-so on my own campus who is doing work in this area, and they are an expert. So I might just leave that knowledge up to them. And I think that in my mind is an equally good way to look at how this could fit in, especially as it would relate to our ORIC program. With the institutional capacity, right? Identifying those people at an institution that have these competencies and this knowledge and having them as a group of people together.
Yeah, Claire has asked if we're considering describing each of the competencies in greater detail. And I do think that will have to be part of the work moving forward.
If I recall correctly, it's been a while since we submitted the text for the chapter, but we went in a lot more detail, not within each competency, but within the 11 domains that we had identified. We went into a lot more detail of what we thought as a group those competencies were trying to accomplish. I know that's in the chapter. So at least there's a little bit more fine-grained detail there. All right, well, I think if there are no more questions or comments, we can give you 2 minutes of scheduled time back. If you have any other questions or comments or feedback, you can contact any one of us, Miles, Janice, Kerry, or myself, and give us any feedback or questions you would have. We are very open and welcoming to any sort of criticisms we can get.